Well, as Emily is not here this morning, as far as I can tell, I'll let you in on a little insight into our marriage. Most weekends at our house, a long conversation ensues between Emily and me about what movie we should watch after the kids go to bed. Invariably, we spend up more time choosing a movie than we do actually watching one. It takes a while because my preference would be sci-fi, fantasy, even horror if I'm in the mood, and Emily has absolutely zero time for any of those things. And so a few years ago I picked a movie that I thought was a comedy, a little on the darker side maybe, but still everybody's happy. Until halfway through the movie I'm reminded that it's actually a horror movie, and fairly gory at that. Emily's utterly scandalized, the movie gets turned off, and I haven't been allowed to pick a movie unsupervised since. Sometimes you think you're in one kind of story, and it turns out you're actually in another. You think you know where a story's going, how it's going to play out, how it's going to end, and then it turns out nothing like you expected. Well, today we celebrate a central story of our faith, the Ascension of Christ, the grand ending to the gospel story as Jesus gathers his disciples and calls them to be his witnesses in Jerusalem and Judea and Samaria and to the very ends of the earth. And then he floats off into the sky, leaving them there, scratching their heads. I mean, what an exit. What I've always loved about this account is that after all this time with Jesus, the disciples still don't understand the story that they're in. Are you at this time going to restore the kingdom to Israel? They ask. You can almost hear the longing in their voice. You have to remember here that when the disciples upped and left everything to follow Jesus all those years earlier, they thought they were signing up for something very specific. Jesus was the Messiah. He was the one who was supposed to rout the Roman Empire and return Israel to the people. That is the story that the disciples thought they were a part of, and they've been waiting for him to do that for years. And sometimes it kind of looked like he would, that at various times this moment would be the moment. But every time, it turned out it wasn't. And here is Jesus returning to God at the very end of the story. And the only thing the disciples can think to ask is, are you finally going to do what we've wanted you to do all along? After all this time journeying with Christ, their vision of what it is Jesus came to do is still so small, so bounded by the little patch of world and history that they care about. And Jesus says to them, you're dreaming too small. I'm sending you as witnesses, not just to Israel, but to the very ends of the earth. Sometimes it turns out we're in a very different story to the one we thought we were in. And like the disciples, those kinds of moments in our lives can leave us wondering where we go from here. Trudging through the interminable reading list that they throw you at grad school can be a real bane, but every now and then you come across an absolute gem. And for me, these last couple of years, one of those gems was coming across the French philosopher Paul Ricoeur. Ricoeur talks about how life is best understood as a narrative. He calls life a cloth woven of stories told. What he's getting at is that our lives are not just made up of the experiences that we have, but the way we interpret and make sense of those experiences. Life is the sum of the stories that we tell about ourselves. What kind of person do we believe ourselves to be? What do we think our life is all about? What's the meaning or the thread that runs through it? And many of those stories don't work out the way that we had thought or hoped they would. Ricoeur calls these kinds of moments in our lives narrative wreckage, where the story you thought you had been part of starts to fall apart. You thought a relationship would go the distance, and it doesn't. You had hopes and dreams, and then you watched them float off into the sky. You saw your best laid plans fall to pieces. Or you might watch the whole story crumble around you through those shattering moments in life that you couldn't have seen coming. Those times and seasons can be disorienting for us. They can leave us wondering how we go about starting again. The question for us then, as people of faith, is what do we do with those stories that didn't turn out the way we hoped? When, like the disciples, we find ourselves asking, where do we go from here? I love that bit in the Acts version of the story this morning where the angels appear and say to the disciples, "Men of Galilee, why do you stand there looking up toward heaven?" Maybe a better translation is, "Why are you staring off into space?" The angels tell the disciples that Christ who went into heaven is going to come back in just the way he left. So get a move on. There's work to do. But actually, I think perhaps the disciples are staring off into the sky because really they don't know where to go from here. They always thought that they were part of one story, the restoring of the kingdom of Israel. And they find out that they've been part of a different story this whole time. The Ascension, this weird, incredible moment in the Christian story that we rehearse every year. This is not just a nice bow tied around the Jesus story to give it a good ending. On the one hand, it's a moment of deep narrative wreckage for the disciples, where the story that they had been telling and the story they thought they were a part of falls to pieces as Jesus floats off into the sky with all their hopes and dreams for Israel. But on the other hand, the disciples are also invited to realize that their faith isn't shipwrecked here, that their faith is an unfinished story, that just because Jesus is leaving doesn't mean the story has come to an end. Precisely at that place where the disciples think the story ends, the place where they think Jesus is finally going to do what they've wanted him to do all along, it turns out to be just another beginning. This is important for us because, like the disciples, we at times can hit dead ends in our faith too. We might watch as stories that we thought would end one way turn out to end another. At times we might even find ourselves standing in the wreckage of our faith and wondering how to keep going. And in those moments we often end up doing one of two things. On the one hand, we can leave the faith entirely. We can conclude that the story we were sold that promised us so much, it was just a lie. This is the way for so many people in our culture today. Maybe they grew up in the church and in the faith, and they were promised that those things would answer all their questions, and then it turned out that they couldn't. And so they struggled to find a way to include all their questions and doubts and difficulties into the story of their faith. So instead, the whole thing collapses. Or maybe even worse, we can stick it out, going through the motions. We can let faith become rote and routine, but not alive anymore. Faith still has some purchase in our lives, superficially maybe, but we don't really find ourselves in the story anymore. The gospel story no longer has anything to tell us about our stories, about what our lives mean. Well, I think there's grace for both of these moments in our faith journeys. Remember that the disciples that Jesus left the Great Commission to were people with questions, doubts, misunderstandings. They weren't disqualified because they hadn't figured it all out yet. The problem, I think, is that we often tend to think of faith as a static thing. Faith should be unchanging and unmoving. Doubts creep in, but they're swiftly dealt with. And I think we feel that way because if faith is subject to change, then can it really help us? We want a faith that's solid and stable and not moved by the challenges we face or the questions thrown up for us by life. And so when we do find our faith shaken, when, like the disciples, we watch as the story we thought we were in collapses around us, we don't know how to carry on from there. But perhaps faith isn't as static as we think it is. You know, it's not often that Hollywood gets the church right. But one time I think they did, is in the movie Conclave that came out a couple of years ago. Anybody have the chance to catch that? If you haven't seen it, I highly recommend it. It's not a horror, I promise. Actually, it's a brilliant, campy drama about the Catholic Church going through the process of electing its next pope. And as you can imagine, it's all about just how gossipy and catty that whole process must be. But toward the end of the movie, there's a scene in which all the cardinals are gathered together. and they're fighting about what to do. All the divisions of church politics are laid bare, and there's a growing contingent in the ranks that is totally resistant to change. They want a Holy Father who will be militant, who will stand up for church purity against the big bad world outside that always threatens change and corruption. And a young Latin American cardinal stands up and addresses the college in a beautiful line. He says, "The church is not tradition. The church is not the past. The church is what we do next." The church is what we do next. Our faith, the faith of the Ascension, has never been static. Hear me right, our traditions, our histories, the stories we've always told about what it means to be the church and to be people of faith, these are what make us who we are, but they can grow stale. They can stagnate. Our faith isn't intended to be a monument to the past. It's a living, breathing inheritance. And our role is always to tell those old stories again in a new time, in new ways, for new people. The sign that we've grown stagnant isn't that we keep telling these old stories, keep embedding ourselves in the tradition we've inherited. It's that that tradition and those stories only have things to say about where we've been, or how far we've strayed from where we were, but they have nothing to say about where we're going. If being the church means staring off into the spaces where something once happened, where our faith once lived, then just maybe our stories have grown old. And what we need is the angels to come along, kick us up the butt, and say, "Why do you stand there looking up toward heaven?" For us, and for our time, perhaps instead of staring off into the sky, wishing that things didn't have to change, we're invited to participate in a new story that God is telling in the world. May we be part of the story that God is telling in our time, and may we have the courage to always follow Christ into what comes next.